Brought to you by Charity Mobile. Switch to the phone company that supports your beliefs. All plans start under $50 before taxes and surcharges. Use promo code TRADITION at CharityMobile.com for a special offer.
We're going to start today with just a very brief update on the news story reported to you, yesterday, which is that the Pope was going to appoint a new archbishop for Vienna. He had been the apostolic administrator of Vienna for some time and had denied that he wanted to be the archbishop, and he didn't know who was going to be named bishop. Well, turns out it happened yesterday. John Henry Weston with the news posted to X. It's official. Pope Leo has appointed an ultra-liberal who pushed women's ordination and communion for non-Catholics as the Archbishop of Vienna, Austria. It was added to the resignations and appointments list posted yesterday on the Vatican website. That's a screen cap from the Vatican website. The Holy Father has appointed the Reverend Josef Grundwedel, until now apostolic administrator of the same diocese, as the Metropolitan Archbishop of Vienna, Austria. Worth noting there, by the way, that that C is typically weird how that posted. But that C is typically associated with a cardinal. So don't be shocked. The Pope calls a consistory. It's not too late to do one for December, but it's a little late in the year for it. But maybe next year he'll hold a consistory to announce a bunch of new cardinals, and he'll be one of them. For those of you who don't seem to understand that the Pope's got a track record of appointing awful men to various places in the episcopate. Almost all of the bishops he's appointed have been awful, and we can add that man to the list. So there's your brief update from yesterday. Speaking of awful, I personally am not a big fan of Opus Dei, mostly sharing the same attitude about them that most traditionalists have, which is that they seem like a good place to get traditionally minded men, and especially men, but also women, to go to there to keep them dedicated to the new Mass and all things Vatican II, but from a very conservative angle, instead of letting the desire that usually represents for people to seek that kind of thing out, do what it would naturally do in the church, which is lead people to capital T traditional Catholicism. But that's about my issue with it. Pretty big one, but nothing like this. You see, there's been a concerted effort by American Magazine, the National Catholic Reporter, Massimo Fagioli, and across the West, the progressive element in the church, to demonize Opus Dei as a right-wing organization. And it came out last night that the Pope has signed a document that, when it's made officially public, is going to destroy Opus Dei functionally. The various parts of it will continue to exist. There will probably be an Opus Dei, but it won't be Opus Dei anymore. So we're going to start here with LifeSite. Headline: Pope Leo reportedly set to break up Opus Dei. The breakup of Opus Dei would be unprecedented in the church's recent history, essentially disbanding the most famous personal prelature in Catholicism. And there's an implication to this, and it's in the words personal prelature. One of our hosting service is having weird issues this morning. But one of the issues we've seen in the question regarding the Latin Mass is the future of the FSSP and the Institute of Christ the King, and in theory bringing the SSPX into things. But it's the question of bishops. And one solution to that has been seen is to essentially put a bishop or two over all of these groups as a personal prelature. And Opus Dei is often cited as the example of that. There's a lot of governing things that go into that with Opus Dei, but they're usually cited as the example of how to move forward with solving the traditional Latin Mass problem once and for all in the church. And now they're smashing that organization. So keep that in mind. There is a tie to the more traditional Catholic organizations. But here are the details of the article. It's not very long here. Pope Leo XIV is reportedly set to break up Opus Dei into independent parts, according to Info Vaticana, a Spanish outlet with ties to the personal prelature. Reforms have been finalized, which would mean the definitive break of the original structure. Two independent sources told Letters from Leo. So now they're citing two different Catholic media outlets, Letters from Leo being very much a progressive left-wing Catholic outlet, Info Vaticana being on the other side. The sources say the rupture will be instigated by the Pope within a few weeks. The new statutes would reportedly split Opus Dei into 3 separate parts. A clerical prelature made up only of Opus Dei's incardinated priests, now significantly reduced, meaning they're going to reduce the number of priests they have, reduce the size of the Opus Dei priestly organization itself. 2, the Priestly Society of the Holy Cross, comprised of diocesan clergy who wish to partake in Opus Dei's charism, now no longer affiliated with the prelature. So they may, look to their founder for inspiration and things, but they're no longer part of Opus Dei, thus cutting the legs out from them in terms of how many priests they have. And then 3, a lay faithful association, now fully independent association for all lay members, including numinaries, associates, supernumeraries, and cooperators who've previously been included under the prelature, meaning the lay members of Opus Dei will no longer be part of Opus Dei. It'll be a separate organization. Thus, Opus Dei will cease to exist as a unified juridical and spiritual entity. Pope Francis previously initiated structural reform of Opus Dei, issuing a motu proprio in 2022 stipulating it would no longer be led by a bishop, saying that, quote, a form of government based more on charism than on hierarchical authority is needed. And what this does to the organization is it destroys it as a force within the church. It separates it into various different organizations and removes its leadership. That is the takeaway. They will no longer be able to influence anything going on in the church. What is going on with StreamYards this morning? They put in an update. Our host that I use for streaming here put in an update this morning, and it looks like it's having some weird issues. So just please bear with me today. But Opus Dei will no longer be able to influence things. That is really what's going on, both in the church and outside the church. I'll show you here the propaganda campaign from progressives against Opus Dei. It's why it actually makes me a little sympathetic to Opus Dei, even though I'm not inclined normally to be such. National Catholic Reported published this fairly recently, 7 Decades of Papacy Illuminated, in new book, Jesus Wept. It talks about how all these bad things influencing the Catholic Church since Pius XII. You scroll all the way to the bottom here. After hearing all these horror stories, allegedly, about evil things trying to worm their way into influencing the church, it ends on this. The Roman Catholic Church is indeed like a battlefield, as Francis said, and is split into warring schismatic camps, as Massimo Fagioli has written in The Tablet. The Tablet is a UK news outlet that used to be this mighty conservative Catholic outlet and is now basically the UK's equivalent of the National Catholic Reporter. It continues saying, Francis was in his final months as Jesus Wept was published. Now a beleaguered church has Opus Dei operatives with perspiring, meaning sweaty palms, assisting Donald Trump in waging war on the poor. Would they recognize Jesus if he wept in their boardrooms? So yes, Opus Dei is an organization that is helping Donald Trump wage war on the Catholic Church. If you can believe it. Amazing what these guys are doing. But that's not the only one. America Magazine published this hysterical piece. It's a review of a movie about Opus Dei, published in January of this year. I remember reporting on this channel, but last year, that Francis was thinking about crushing Opus Dei. And remember, Pope Leo promised to continue the reform efforts of Pope Francis. And this is what it's going to look like. But here we go. To give you a little background on Opus Dei, this is here in this article, they do dub them as a right-wing organization. You have to wonder, is the reason Opus Dei is being crushed is because they are conservative in a post-conciliar sense. They have all the, their masses are reverent. They generally, on day-to-day morality, teach the Catholic faith. They teach Catholic theology. So they're not exactly what we would call ecumenical or synodal in nature. And with their ties to secular right-wing politicians, especially in the United States these days, said that J.D. Vance has got some ties to them, allegedly. You have to wonder. Here's a little details on Opus Dei. They were, according to the article, founded in 1928 to be an association of mostly lay Catholics who would seek holiness through their daily activities and secular jobs. Most members are supernumeraries, which means they can be married and live independently in their own homes. Others are numeraries, making a promise of celibacy and living at Opus Dei centers in community. A few thousand women are members at the rank of numerary assistants to serve the male numeraries. There are associates who, like numeraries, are celibate, but live outside an Opus Dei residence. And finally, there are fewer than 2,000 members of the Priestly Society of the Holy Cross who report directly to the superior of Opus Dei. When the author of this documentary on them began his research, he meant for the resulting project to be a deep dive into the Spanish bank Banco Popular, which collapsed in 2017. Through his investigation, Gore discovered a group known as the Syndicate that was responsible for funding Banco Popular. The dissolution of the companies that comprised the syndicate was simultaneous with the bank's collapse, and this concurrence of events brought Gore into greater touch with the secretive world of Opus Dei. The religious organization was involved because many of the major players in Opus Dei were also major players in the bank, none more so than the Spanish financier and influential Opus Dei member Luis Valtaberner. Gore structures his book around three complementary narratives: one financial, one political, and one ecclesial. While there is also some history involved in this study, it is almost always serves to advance one of Gore's three main trajectories. The financial account is where Gore is obviously most at home. The Valtaberner's illness and death, the role of his membership in Opus Dei, played in the sidelining of his brother Javier from his role in the bank, and the details of infighting to take over the reins of the bank are all fascinating aspects of this account. This is all new material that Gore has uncovered through painstaking research, etc., etc. But it's here he's something where he says that's interesting. Tracing the flow of money through the various layers of companies, it seems the beneficiaries of this corrupt bank were charitable foundations with one thing in common: links to Opus Dei. Gore does a fine job of discovering where the money came from, where it went, and how Opus Dei was involved, always doing its part to be disassociated from the bank. Though there was no paper trail that led back to Opus Dei as an organization at any point, Gore clearly shows the connections. This is the greatest achievement of the book and a major development from John Allen's reporting in his 2005 work, Opus Dei. So you've had 20 years at least of progressives going after Opus Dei. The political narrative of the book can trace itself from the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco right through Donald J. Trump. The link, oddly enough, is Opus Dei's founder, St. Jose Maria, originally Jose Maria, as Gore tells us, Escriva. At one stage, Escriva gave a private 6-day retreat for Franco and his wife at El Pardo Palace, where they lived. Even though Escriva insisted Opus Dei would operate above politics, he made a personal relationship with Franco, and the dictator was a benefactor of both Escriva and Opus Dei. Skip ahead a few generations to when the U.S. political operative Leonard Leo enters the picture. In recent years, it has become clear that no history of Catholicism in the United States in the 21st century will be possible without a careful focus on Leo, whose financial resources and political connections are perhaps without compare in Washington. Leo's longtime connection with the Federalist Society alone has shaped the U.S. Supreme Court for generations to come, as President Trump appointed 3 judges recommended by Leo for the current court. While Gore notes that Leo is not himself a member of Opus Dei, Leo is a significant contributor to Opus Dei causes, as many financial organizational links with the prelature. And it goes on, talking about, the links of the financier, the American financier for Opus Dei being linked to the Trump administration and American right-wing Catholicism, and on and on and on. And then, of course, linking Trump to Franco, because why not? This is, American magazine at its worst. But this appears to be political in nature, going into Tim Bush of the Napa Institute and all the rest of it. I wonder why they're going after Opus Dei. It's politics. That's what it is. That is all it is. Amazing stuff. Truly amazing stuff. And they're going to crush Opus Dei for this reason. And this came on news that when I saw that, it came on the same day as some news that I saw that I found absolutely hysterical. Apparently, they're keeping the spirit of Francis alive and well in the Vatican. He may be gone now for almost 6 months. Yes, it's been practically 6 months. But they invoke him still. We see Pope Leo do this all the time, and one could say that, well, that's because he's being respectful to his venerable predecessor. It's a standard thing popes do. Well, mostly standard. Didn't really hear Francis do it that much with Benedict, except when it suited his purposes. But Leo does it all the time. Well, we get this story. This should shed another bit of light on the Opus Dei question. See, Opus Dei, for everything else you can say about them, they offered reverent masses, Like I said before, taught Catholic theology, taught Catholic morality. Generally speaking, if you found out that someone catechizing your kids was Opus Dei, you probably weren't going to be too concerned about that because they teach your kids the faith, right? Well, go to the Vatican or go to Catholic News Agency for this astonishing headline. Vatican liturgist urges U.S. Church to follow Pope Francis's guidelines on the Mass. That is what's part of the story, I think, too. We're seeing play out right now in real time a battle over the Mass. Clearly, the traditional Mass is front and center in that story, but it's not the only story. We have seen issues come down from various dioceses where reverent Novus Ordos are getting banned. I'm hearing that whispers of some of the high-profile dioceses that have been getting constantly reported on who banned the Mass, who banned the traditional Mass, are also getting ready to move against the ordinary form of the Mass in its more reverent expressions, getting rid of altar rails and that kind of thing. I'll keep you posted as details become more clear. And this is the Vatican liturgist here is one of the architects of Traditionis Custodes. He wants the Latin Mass gone, as well as the Cretians of the Latin Mass. In this case, what that means is whenever a priest who wants to offer the traditional Mass but probably can't, so he starts adding things from the traditional Mass into the Novus Ordo, making it super reverent, communion on the tongue, that kind of thing, more Latin, all these other things. And that has caused a great deal of offense among many of the bishops. Here's what a like-minded traveler with them, a fellow traveler, has to say on the matter. Cardinal Arthur Roach, who leads the Vatican's administrative body on the liturgy, encouraged American parishes to better familiarize themselves with Pope Francis's guidelines on the Mass and ensure the former pontiff's writings inform the liturgical formation of clergy and parishioners. Roach, who has served as prefect for the Dicastery for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacrament since 2021, offered the recommendations at a 3-day meeting of the Federation of Diocesan Liturgy Commissions. Pope Francis did not set out to give a systematic treatment of liturgical formation, Roach told the more than 230 participants in the meeting, according to an October 15th FDLC news release. What he was wishing to do was take the Church by the hand and lead her toward the center of the mystery we celebrate, towards the heart of Christ, which burns with its ardent desire that we should draw nigh, take his body and drink his blood, to worship the Father with hearts and minds made new through having been washed in the blood of the Lamb, he said. Roach said the celebration of the Mass must be grounded in the paschal mystery of Christ, and reaffirmed Francis's 2017 comments that the liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council is irreversible. He quoted Francis's 2017 apostolic letter, Desideratio Desideravi, and said the document should be more widely available to parishes. There should be more help to organize guided readings of it. In that document, Francis wrote that, quote, every aspect of the celebration must be carefully tended to, including the space, time, gestures, words, objects, vestments, song, and music. He wrote, quote, such attention would be enough to prevent robbing from the assembly what is owed to it, namely the paschal mystery celebrated according to the ritual that the Church has set down. Roach said the depth and breadth of his liturgical vision offers us countless opportunities to pause for the reflection in order to appreciate the great gift that has been handed on to us in the liturgical books. I do not hesitate to encourage you to be bold, but always charitable in promoting the unique, meaning he called it the unique lex orandi, law of prayer of the Roman Rite. In this case, what he means by that is the phrase he means when talking about the Novus Ordo. They use that phrase in Traditionis Custodes to say that the traditional Mass is actually not a rite of the Roman Church, that the unique lex orandi is the new Mass, that the traditional Mass is not a valid rite of the Church. They said that in Traditionis Custodes. It's on its face stupid thing to say, but they did say that. Discourses on the liturgy that lack a spirit of charity come from a spirit other than that of Christ, which is a dig at anybody who pushes back forcefully against what they're doing. FDLC Executive Director Rita Theron told CNA the document is a beautiful, beautiful text, and the FDLC offers a study guide for parishes that offer discussion, questions, and reflection on the document. And a lot of this sounds fine. Have your masses be worthy of what they are, right? Make sure they reflect what you would want in the church and all this other stuff. That sounds fine. I have never heard of a priest being punished by Rome or a bishop punished by Rome for liturgical malfeasance. allowing silly masses that denigrate the sacrament. All we've ever heard of is traditional masses being crushed, or priests who dare to offer the new mass in a way that looks Catholic getting smacked around by the bishop. That's all we've ever heard. It's too rigid and exclusionary. I do think that's part of the Opus Dei question, is they are too overtly Catholic. They're not synodal. They're not ecumenical. They're not welcoming. They have a Catholic morality and they teach Catholic theology. There are certain things about them that are very questionable and should be subject of reform. How they treat laity, some of their financial issues, all that is valid. But a lot of what they were doing is too Catholic, and their ties to politicians, especially of the wrong variety, according to Rome, is why they're being smacked around and why they will no longer be around as Opus Dei. And one other thing I want to address before we're done, and that is we see these so-called efforts at reforms coming out of Germany, Germany especially, that overtly invoke the McCarrick problem, as we have to call it on these websites, right? Priests doing evil things to the most vulnerable. And they're always linked to, men like James Martin, right? Not saying James Martin himself, be clear, but men of the type who are James Martin has a weird interest in for a priest. And a bishop has decided, and we've covered this bishop before, this is Bishop Marian Eleganti. He's an auxiliary bishop, takes a great deal of risk every time he opens his mouth. He points out the obvious. He says in this piece from LifeSite, church can't address the McCarrick crisis until it confronts James Martin's stuff in the clergy. Reminds people the norm remains marriage in its natural form. The family understood as father, mother, and child. If James Martin types did not live out their love in the flesh, they would gain more than they would lose. Now, this is essentially an open letter from Bishop Marian Eleganti. And there's a lot of truth to this. You might be able to take some issues with a couple things he says, but I think the overwhelming majority of this is in keeping with the spirit of the truth. Here's the bishop in his own words. The following article does not generally condemn people with James Martin tendencies. The Catholic Church has always distinguished between the inviolable dignity of every human person and their inclinations, which may be disordered. Disordered tendencies of the flesh, which exist among people with normal inclinations, as well as those with disordered, are judged by the Church according to the same standards of morality, and, depending on the case, are classified as sinful or seen as a weakness to be corrected. We all struggle with such tendencies. When they are controlled, this greatly distinguishes a person's morality and leads them to holiness. This applies to James Martin types as well as to those who are more natural. The Church considers the acting out of disordered tendencies to be a sin. However, the path to repentance is always open. Here the Church shows mercy. Although the phenomenon of James Martin's stuff in the clergy is viewed in a broader context below, it does not generally offer such people, but only insofar as they become abusive. Naturally inclined people are neither morally superior to the others, nor do they sin less than them in general. Those inclinations in the clergy is a phenomenon sui generis. There's no compelling link between the James Martin sin and abuse, and I do fundamentally disagree with him there, by the way, because he cites the John Jay report, which was heavily edited at the request of the U.S. bishops to omit the very clear data. I've covered that, talked about that before. However, he's working with older data and he's not an American bishop, so I'll cut him some slack. It says, however, the statistical frequency of male victims of the clergy is related to this and deserves a differentiated approach in our case. In other words, if we do not address the real problem, James Martin's stuff in the clergy, we will never be able to deal with the issue of abuse properly. Here, and then he goes into the statistics. You'll notice male, victims are overwhelmingly male. There are female ones. They tend to be the most young, which is, anyway. But in general, for every other group, 8 and above, it's overwhelmingly male. And there's a word for that. Can't use it on YouTube, but it's a word we'll call it the James Martin stuff. After these important preliminary remarks, let us now get to the point. In my opinion, this sin plays a particularly important role in the transformation of society and its traditional ideas about marriage, family, and gender. The new social standards did not simply fall from the sky, but have been in preparation for decades. James Martin type thinkers play an important role in this. Sexuality plays no minor role in the thinking of the Frankfurt School and its heirs, the so-called postmodern deconstructionists. It is therefore necessary to examine not only the philosophy of its thinkers, but also the Sitz im Leben, the biographical context of sexuality and thinking of their philosophy. This is very illuminating. Although no leading representative of the Frankfurt School was of a James Martin type, its so-called critical theory paved the way for the actual deconstructionists and the theorists of gender and strange theory, all of whom are critical or even hostile towards dogmatic guidelines. Among the latter are well-known James Martin types. Foucault, Derrida, and Butler cannot be understood without the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. They shared its distrust of objective reason. Foucault was influenced by Marcuse. Derrida radicalized Foucault. His philosophy, in turn, was of great importance for the development of strange theory. Butler, who rejected all natural categories, connects Foucault and Derrida. Foucault and Barthes are James Martin types. Butler lives in a partnership of a James Martin variety. Abe Kosofsky-Sedgwick is a pioneer of strange theory. Paul B. Prasad is someone who denies their own reality. He even goes beyond such theory. These connections must be recognized. The European Project Union of Equality attempts to implement the ideology of the flesh in the European Union. The main focus is on redefining marriage, family, and sexuality. So-called equality of the flesh and natural inclinations of the flesh are to be implemented in the member states at great expense. Financing of relevant NGOs, education programs, and campaigns in the member states, including educational programs starting in childhood. References to natural difference between men and women are to be ignored. Changes of the flesh and related legal adjustments are to be promoted. Natural parenthood and family are to be broken up in the name of diversity of the flesh. Unfortunately, the church has also been infected by this virus. Supposedly, this is about rights and inclusion of so-called minorities. These are left-wing Marxist parameters that have been penetrated deeply into the church thinking, but are alien to its nature. Nor do they apply in the church. They are wrong. The church excludes sin and error, sinners and heretics, only if they show themselves to be unrepentant and unreasonable. This has nothing to do with discrimination. Exclusive conditions of access to ecclesiastical offices, like the priesthood, result from a correct understanding of the sacrament and do not fall under the category of legal inequality. The church arranges all these things in a just manner, even if many people, for various reasons, do not want to understand or accept this. The moral law applies to all members of the church without distinction. The church's teaching on the James Martin sin remains unchanged and does not need to be repeated here. It is based on scripture and tradition, on the revelation given through Jesus Christ. The body speaks a very clear language. Man and woman are complementary of their physicality and capable, in biblical terms, of becoming one flesh and of producing offspring in this unifying act. In this way, they correspond to the will of the Creator, the eternal order that He has laid down in human nature. Those of a natural inclination and those with a disordered one are referred to by their own physicality to this fulfillment, which can only be fully realized in the natural act. According to the church's teaching, practicing James Martin types therefore live in open contradiction of it. They must therefore deconstruct gender and sexuality in the traditional sense. Such individuals constitute a vanishingly small minority of the total human population. The James Martin sin cannot therefore be normative for the overwhelming majority of people in their understanding of these things. In other words, according to the neutral meaning of the term, it will never become a generally accepted norm, which means that James Martin practices will continue to be subject to pressure to justify themselves, whether one wants to express this or not. A child raised by civilly, united James Martin types will continue to have to explain to themselves and others why they live or grew up with two fathers or mothers and not in a completely normal family, as the majority of children do with their parents. The latter remains the norm, and the other partnerships with adopted children remain the deviation that is subject to pressure to justify itself, in this case, the abnormality. The only way to achieve normality in the neutral sense the word described above would be to renounce and abandon such the way of living. The inclinations of the flesh defined exclusively by lust and technique leads to the downfall of the person, to their unhappiness. This applies without exception to everyone. It also is a recognized truth that male and female sexuality differ. This is also the case with the James Martin sin. These kinds of things, biblically speaking, inspired by the Spirit, is not purely physical. It becomes so more the Spirit is absent. Pure instinctiveness is frustrating and destructive. Many emotional friendships lose their height and their opprobrium precisely because they are lived out in the flesh or primarily serve the purpose of pleasure, as is very often the case with James Martin type men. Even in the more normal, natural inclination, an effort toward chastity is necessary in order not to extinguish the spirit through pure physicality, to use biblical language. Throughout history, there have always been excellent and exemplary friendships between two men or two women, but they would have lost their value if they had been lived out in the flesh. Marriage, traditionally understood, deserves separate treatment. However, James Martin pairings invariably lack many of the positive aspects of their natural equivalent. Two men do not make a mother. Two women cannot make a father. They cannot conceive children in a genuine act of love. And he goes on like that for some time. I'm going to point out something. And I don't mean that like in the, he's a bad bishop. I mean, he is a formal material heretic for the secular world and in the synodal church. That is what he is. It takes a great risk to say that stuff. The James Martin types are in ascendancy right now. Go back to that story I started with you, where Pope Leo has appointed a new bishop in Vienna who will be a cardinal, and he's young. Calls for women's ordination, very open to the James Martin stuff and all the rest of it. Just like virtually every other bishop the Pope has appointed in the last 5 months. That is where we are. But I'm curious what you think about this. So let me know in the comments. Trish said I forgot today was Saturday. Yeah, well, it is definitely a weekend. That is for sure. Rises the amount of times you had to say James Martin reading that. Yeah, this is not a topic that our hosts like too much, and they are the chosen ones of the culture, and especially in America, where you are not allowed to critique them as a group. It is an unfortunate reality I've run into on this platform, and frankly, most of them. But I'm curious what you have to say about this, so let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. Please pray for everybody we spoke about negatively today. James Martin, the Pope, anybody, they need your prayers. Their souls are on the line like they are for everybody else. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.